In the remote outskirts of the Han Empire, where rice paddies stretched farther than the eye could see, and the hum of crickets marked the passage of time, a boy was chosen. He didn't ask to be. He didn't want to be. But in ancient China, beauty in a boy could be both a blessing and a curse. At just 13, his face caught the attention of a provincial magistrate during a local festival. His skin was as pale as ivory, his features delicate, and his movements so graceful they seemed rehearsed by fate. Word traveled quickly. He would make a perfect offering to the court, someone whispered. His parents were summoned, handed a pouch of silver, and assured their son would live in silk and safety, serving the emperor himself. That night, his mother wept quietly into her sleeves. The next morning, he was gone. The journey to the capital was long and cold. Guards avoided eye contact. No one explained what came next. When they arrived at the palace gates, the boy's name was taken from him. He was bathed, shaved, and redressed not in the robes of a servant, but in garments finer than anything he'd ever seen. Robes that clung like second skin and shimmered under torchlight. Yet it was not comfort. It was preparation. He was no longer a son, a child, a person. He was a shadow in the making, groomed for a role he could not understand, one he had no way to escape. Behind those towering walls, in the heart of an empire, a life was about to begin and end in silence. The palace was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Its walls seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing sound and light alike. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The air smelled of burning incense and old wood, the kind that had soaked in centuries of whispers. Inside those walls, he was not the only one. There were dozens, no hundreds of others like him, young boys from forgotten villages, all chosen for the same reason: they were beautiful, obedient, and invisible. But unlike the palace's official wives or celebrated concubines, they had no name in the records, no titles, no lineage. They were not wives nor servants. They were special attendants, a phrase soft enough to mask the truth. They were men turned into playthings for the pleasure of power. Training began immediately. From the moment he awoke, he was told how to sit, how to walk without making noise, how to bow without trembling. A smile must be soft, never wide. His voice must remain gentle, never excited. He learned to pour tea with elegance, to dance slowly with silk sleeves that mimicked the wind, to read poetry he could not understand, and to anticipate the desires of men he would never truly know. Each day blurred into the next. His identity faded. He was no longer a boy with a past, but a vessel sculpted for a future not of his choosing. The eunuchs oversaw everything. Cold-eyed and mechanical, they treated the boys like property. They were not cruel out of malice, but indifference. They had once been boys, too, until a knife had removed their chance at manhood and freedom. Now they were the gatekeepers of obedience, their voices as flat as the stone beneath their feet. "You're here to be seen, not heard," one of them told him during his first week after he failed to bow low enough to a minor prince. The punishment was a night without food and the removal of the thin mattress he'd been given. He slept on the cold floor that night, staring at the ceiling, and wondering whether the stars could see him from behind so much stone. Weeks turned into months. His body grew taller, but not stronger. He was not allowed to run, to laugh, to sweat, only to glide like a ghost between silk-draped halls. Some nights he would catch glimpses of the emperor's chariot returning from council surrounded by guards. On rare occasions, he would be summoned to stand outside the royal chamber, along with other chosen boys dressed in ceremonial robes, silent and perfectly still. Sometimes the emperor would pick one of them with just a glance, a nod. Other times, he would walk past them all, leaving them to return to their quarters without a word, holding their breath until the next time. Then one night it was him. The order came suddenly. A hand on his shoulder. A whisper. "You've been chosen." He was taken to the bathhouse where he was scrubbed until his skin burned. Fragrant oils were rubbed into his scalp. His eyebrows were shaped. His lips tinted faintly red. His robe was soft, almost weightless, and it shimmered like moonlight. He was led through quiet corridors until he reached a golden door guarded by soldiers who didn't look at him. Inside, the emperor waited not as a divine ruler, not as a god in human form, but as a man. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying part. He knelt beside the low platform. The room was dark, lit only by lanterns flickering against silk walls. He kept his eyes on the floor. No words were spoken, only gestures, only silence. What happened that night was not violent nor tender. It was ritual, expected, forgotten before dawn. When he returned to his chamber, the eunuch assigned to him said nothing, only handed him a hot cloth and left. He sat alone in the dim candlelight, holding that cloth to his chest, wondering whether what had just happened was real. There was no triumph, no transformation, only a dull ache where his heart used to be. In the following days, everything changed. He was moved to a private chamber larger, more decorated. The food was better. The guards nodded to him now. The other boys kept their distance. They whispered about him in hallways sometimes with envy, sometimes pity. He had been favored, and that meant he was no longer one of them. He was something else now closer to power, but further from safety. Because favoritism in the palace was a game of knives. It invited jealousy schemes' attention from those who saw influence as currency. The emperor never summoned him 2 nights in a row, never looked at him in daylight. Their connection was secret, quiet, and fleeting. But to others, even the rumor of affection was reason enough to watch him. One concubine, one of the emperor's official wives, sent a maid to visit him. She left poisoned tea in his chamber. He drank it, but not enough to die, just enough to collapse and cough blood through the night. When he recovered, nothing was said. No punishment was dealt. Silence was the way of the court. And so he learned to walk slower, to smile less, to make himself forgettable again. Because in the palace to be seen was dangerous, and to be remembered was fatal. But it was too late. He had already been marked. The favor didn't last. Nothing ever did in the Forbidden City. It started with silence. At first he thought the emperor was merely occupied council meetings, military matters, foreign dignitaries. Days passed without summons. Then weeks. He waited by the screen each night the way he used to, hands folded neatly, eyes fixed on the corridor. But no one came. The guards who once bowed now ignored him. The food returned to its plain simplicity. The scented oils were gone. Even his robe, once changed, every morning began to smell faintly of dust and time. Whispers returned to the halls this time, colder, sharper. He was just a passing fancy, they said. Too quiet, too obedient, no fire. Another boy had caught the emperor's eye, a boy younger, softer, and more delicate in his defiance. He laughed at inappropriate times. He asked the emperor questions. He reminded him of something lost. And just like that, the heart of power shifted elsewhere. The room he was given, the private chamber that once felt like a palace within a palace, was now a cage. He was not allowed to return to the quarters of the lesser attendants. He had climbed too high to descend, but he had also fallen too far to be noticed. He floated in a quiet limbo, neither loved nor forgotten, just inconvenient. Days melted into one another. The seasons changed, though he barely noticed. The plum blossoms came and went outside the garden wall he wasn't permitted to cross. He stopped reading poetry. He stopped combing his hair. he stopped caring. Loneliness was no longer a feeling, it was air, and he breathed it every day. He began speaking to shadows, not because he believed they answered, but because the sound of his own voice reminded him he still existed. Sometimes at night, he would remember his village, the warmth of his mother's hands, the rough bark of the tree he used to climb the sound of laughter, untrained and free. And he would weep, but silently, because even crying loudly felt like disobedience in a place where everything had to be beautiful. One day, a maid brought him a small scroll of paper by mistake, meant for someone else. He read it anyway. It was a letter from one concubine to another, filled with longing, sorrow, and desperation. He read it over and over, tracing the ink with his fingers. Then, in a moment of impulse, he wrote one of his own. Not to anyone in particular. Just a letter, a confession, a memory, a last fragment of the person he used to be. He folded it gently, tucked it inside the lining of his pillow, and felt something strange relief. But peace, like favor, never lasted. 2 weeks later, during a routine cleaning, the letter was discovered. It was taken directly to the inner court. He was summoned not to the emperor, but to the eunuch masters. They didn't yell. They didn't strike him. That would have been too merciful. Instead, they asked one question. Who was this for? He said nothing. That silence sealed his fate. He was not executed. That would have been a public statement. No, he was reassigned, moved, forgotten by design. They placed him in what was known as the West Wing, a part of the palace no one visited unless they had to. It wasn't a prison, not in the official sense. There were no bars, no chains, but there were no windows either, no light. The room was small, cold, and perpetually damp. The walls, sweated in summer, cracked in winter. He was given food once a day left at the door. No one spoke to him, not even the guards. He was 20 by then. Inside that room, time didn't move forward. It sank. He had no mirror, but he imagined what he looked like now, older, thinner, hollower. He whispered stories to himself, told imaginary tales about a boy who escaped the palace, who ran through forests, who found a woman who loved him and called him by his real name. He gave that boy the freedom he never had. And slowly, that boy became more real than he was. Years passed, though he stopped counting them. The seasons no longer touched him. His world was reduced to 1 room, 4 walls, and a body that grew weaker each month. His hair grew long and matted, his nails curled, and his bones pressed against skin like branches under frost. No one addressed him by name. He suspected they no longer remembered it. Sometimes a new eunuch would slide food through the slot and glance in just long enough to look startled. Not out of pity, out of confusion, as if he were some ghost story they were told wasn't real. At night, he would press his ear to the cold stone floor and pretend to hear footsteps. On rare days, when a breeze somehow slipped beneath the cracks in the wall, he would close his eyes and imagine it carried the scent of home. He spoke to himself more now, out loud, not to keep sane, but because silence had become unbearable. He spoke of things he'd never done, of places he'd never seen, of people who never existed. In his mind, he built a life so vivid, so full of light and color, that sometimes he forgot it was a lie. And yet the palace carried on just beyond his walls. Emperors came and went. Policies changed. Wars were fought. Dynasties rose and collapsed. But inside that room, nothing moved. No voice called for him. No footsteps ever returned. He was not punished, not executed, not freed, just unspoken. One winter morning, after years of silence, a chambermaid, new perhaps unfamiliar with protocol, entered his room to clean. What she found wasn't shocking. It was expected. He lay on his side knees, tucked in like a sleeping child. His body thin and brittle, his skin pale from years without sunlight. His eyes were open but empty. He had passed away days before, maybe longer. No one could tell. She screamed, and the noise echoed down the corridor, disturbing the perfect order of the palace for just a moment. Soon, a few guards came. A eunuch arrived. They carried his body out without ceremony, wrapped loosely in a faded cloth. No prayers were spoken. No name was recorded. No one wept. They buried him in the back garden near the refuse well beneath a crooked tree no one had tended in decades. No stone marked the spot. Only the broken half of a wooden comb tucked quietly beside him, a tiny artifact of a life erased. And so the boy who had once been chosen for his beauty, who had once knelt beside emperors, who had once dreamed of escape, was now dust in the soil of the very place that had devoured him. But stories do not always end with death. Sometimes they linger quietly, like dust in the folds of old silk, like the faint scent of sandalwood on stone that refuses to fade. Years after he was buried, no one in the palace spoke of him. New attendants arrived. New names were whispered in the emperor's ear. New favorites walked the same halls he once did, wore the same robes, booed with the same trembling hands. The cycle continued. The machine of power never paused for grief, not for boys like him. But not everything was lost. One afternoon, long after his name had been erased from the records, an aging eunuch passed by the crooked tree where the boy had been buried. The eunuch paused not out of guilt nor grief, but something older than both memory. He bent down slowly, his bones aching from decades of service, and ran his fingers across the soil. Something was there, half buried, worn smooth from time. It was the broken comb. He held it in his hand for a long while. He remembered the boy, not his name perhaps, but the way he walked too silently. The way he once smiled, not out of happiness, but out of obedience. The way he stared at the stars through the lattice window when he thought no one was watching. The eunuch did not speak. He simply placed the comb into his sleeve and walked away. He never mentioned it to anyone, but for a brief moment someone had remembered, and that in a world designed to forget was rebellion. Some say the concubine story was eventually written down, not by a historian, not in royal documents, but in a series of anonymous poems passed among servants and scribes. They were simple, written in plain verse, but beneath each line lay the quiet ache of someone who had once seen him, someone who had once cared. The poem spoke of the boy behind the curtain of the shadow, with eyes like winter rain, of a name not spoken but never truly gone. Of course, no one knows if those poems were truly about him. History rarely gives certainty to the forgotten, but sometimes memory doesn't need to be exact to be true. What remains is a feeling, a whisper in the wall, a hollow in the stone floor where someone used to kneel every night. A silence so heavy it becomes the only proof he was ever there, and so what remains, not his name. That was taken from him the day he entered the palace, not his voice. That was trained out of him until he spoke only when spoken to, and even then in whispers. Not even his body, which was laid to rest beneath a crooked tree with no marker, no blessing, no one to mourn. What remains is absence. An empty space in the story of a dynasty. A silence in the footnotes of emperors. A blank spot in the architecture of power that once required boys like him to exist quietly, beautifully, and without resistance. His tragedy was not just that he suffered. Many suffered. His tragedy was that he was never meant to be remembered. that his suffering was designed into the system, expected, normalized, erased. He wasn't a mistake. He was a function, a tool, an ornament. And when he broke emotionally, physically, spiritually, he was quietly set aside like all things that no longer serve a purpose. But within that terrifying silence lies the truth of many. Because he was not alone. Throughout imperial history, male concubines, whether named as such or not, were chosen, manipulated, and forgotten. Some were lovers. Some were toys. Some were sacrificed in political games they never understood. And all of them were trained to believe that their lives only mattered when someone else desired them. That they were only visible in the reflection of royal attention. And when that light faded, they disappeared. Today, we speak their stories not to glorify suffering, but to acknowledge it, to look at the machine of history and recognize the gears that ground flesh and bone to dust, all in the name of beauty, power, tradition. We remember him not as a victim, not as a scandal, but as a symbol of the voiceless, the obedient, the erased. The lives history deems too inconvenient to preserve. There is something deeply human in that. Because when we strip away the silk robes, the marble halls, the gold-threaded titles, what remains are people, soft, fragile yearning, wanting only to be seen, to be loved, to be remembered. And in that small act of telling his story, of imagining the pain, the loneliness, the quiet courage it took to endure, we offer something no emperor ever gave him witness. Somewhere beneath the dust of dynasties and the weight of centuries, a boy once dreamed of open skies of grass underfoot, of someone saying his name. He may be forgotten by history, but not by us. Not anymore.